Good morning and welcome to AIADA's AutoTalk, held the third Tuesday of every month. Please plan on joining us for future programming. I'm Dan Barson, your host for today's program. Today's session is cyber fraud. Before we start, let me give you a few reminders. We're going to be repeating today's program at 4 p.m. So if there's some folks at your business or dealership and you think they'll benefit from today's programming, please have them join us for the 4 p.m. session. The recording will go out by the end of the week to all those that registered. If you have any questions during today's session, please feel free and enter those under the Q&A section of your screen on the bottom right side of your page. And please, at the end of today's session, remain on the line. We have some really exciting program announcements to share with you. Now I'd like to introduce Amy Machold. Amy is Vice President of Wholesale Financial Crimes, Risk and Compliance, also Fraud Risk Management. And with that, I'd like to introduce Amy. Amy, take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. During today's webinar, we'll review some recent fraud stats and then dive into account takeover fraud and imposter fraud and the best practices you should follow to protect yourself and your company. Then we'll wrap up by outlining what you should do with the information garnered from today's call. So let's go ahead and get started. According to the 2016 AFP survey, 73% of organizations experienced attempted or actual payments fraud, which is gradually climbing year over year. And 42% of them report that the number of fraud incidents increased, while 48% of organizations were exposed to wire fraud in 2015. Now, this is a significant increase from the 27% that said that they were exposed in 2014 and only the 14% that indicated that they were exposed to wire fraud in 2013. So it is growing quite tremendously. So with those statistics in mind, it's important to become educated around the online fraud threats of account takeover fraud and imposter fraud. So let's first start with account takeover fraud. So account takeover fraud involves a fraudster stealing your confidential information to access your online accounts directly. They typically accomplish this by social engineering, which for those of you who may not understand social engineering, this is where the fraudster is basically manipulating you into performing actions or divulging confidential information by impersonating a trustworthy entity. Or they can obtain this confidential information via malware that was unknowingly downloaded to your device, which captures all on-screen actions and supports these session takeover activities. It's important to understand that anyone who uses a PC for email or web surfing is at risk for downloading malware. Carriers of malware include infected documents attached to emails, links in emails that are connected to an infected site, perhaps even infected search engine results and documents, and even videos. The list goes on and on. And social media has become a goldmine for fraudsters as well, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. So the goal, again, for fraudsters is to leverage your credentials to move your funds from your account to theirs. Now, you might be sitting there saying to yourself, I know all about those phishing attempts. I never fall for them. They're so obvious. But are they? Fraudsters are achieving a higher success rate with phishing attempts because gone are those days where the emails are laden with grammatical errors, typos, misspellings, even fuzzy logos. Cyber criminals have focused on making their messages more believable. They have learned how to appropriately use the English language in written form and are careful to use crisp reproductions of company logos. And these changes have garnered them successful rates of downloading malware. And social media usage is fueling the fraudsters' efforts as well. So according to an interesting study performed by the Polytechnic Institute of New York, individuals who overshare on Facebook or Twitter, for example, are more likely to become victims of phishing scams and other online fraud than those who are more introverted, share less, or don't even have social media accounts. And the information being shared is providing criminals with the fodder that they need to construct those personalized, targeted, and thus more believable messages, which you then open and download the malware. And I'm sorry to say that credulous users are a weak link, as there is still a prevalent mindset that phishing attempts are blatantly obvious. Organizations that do not have a robust training program to educate users and heighten their sensitivity to phishing attempts will become a victim. And it's not about when, it's not about if, it is about when. So what can you do to protect yourself and your business from account takeover fraud? Well, implement some, if not all, of the best practices you see here. For example, monitoring accounts on a daily basis and using proactive notification services will bring early awareness to a situation. The sooner you spot a fraudulent transaction, the sooner you can start the recovery efforts and take steps to ensure you do not become a victim again. It's also important to understand the typical behavior of your online portal. For example, here at Wells Fargo, we do not prompt for a token at the time of sign-on, nor do we ever ask you to take immediate action via pop-up messages. We remind our Wells Fargo customers that if they experience abnormal behavior, to stop and call us immediately. But they only understand it's abnormal behavior if they first understand what that typical sign-on process is all about. Dual custody is also one of the most effective fraud deterrents in a layered security approach. But for dual custody to work as intended, the initiator and the approver must be on two separate devices. The initiator and the approver must also pay close attention to the transaction details, not just give them that rubber stamp. And being prepared and building internal controls, whatever works for your company, is the first step. Consistent adherence to those policies, however, is the key. So this is a quote from one of our customers who was a victim of impostor fraud. So what is impostor fraud? Impostor fraud is where a fraudster poses as a person of authority within your company or a vendor or business partner and requests a payment or a change to an existing payment instructions. If you act on the request, you send money directly to the fraudster. Now, at Wells Fargo, we refer to this type of fraud as impostor fraud, but you may also have heard about this fraud in the industry with the names of either supply chain fraud, man in the email, masquerading, and the FBI classifies this as business email compromise, or BEC. So however you refer to this type of fraud that we're going to talk about next, just remember it is the same. So imposter fraud, business email compromise, supply chain fraud, whatever you call it, it is all rooted in the same type of MO that the fraudsters are using. So let's take a look at how fraudsters are making contact with their victims. Typically, the fraudsters reach to their victims for imposter fraud via email, and specifically it's email spoofing. So what is email spoofing? Well, that is when someone purchases an email domain that is very similar to your company's domain, but just ever so slightly different, as you can see here in this example on the screen. This is an example of a spoofed email. Note the extra I that's circled. We also see lowercase i's replaced with lowercase l's or things of those like. Spoofing a domain is incredibly easy and low-tech to do. Companies readily provide their email addresses on their corporate websites in order to build that rapport with the customers, right? However, what you're doing in the lens of customer experience and customer service, we're also then providing this information to fraudsters, and this is key information that they need to help build their attack. Industry security experts recommend for companies to purchase every possible variation of their email domain before a fraudster can do so. Purchasing domains is not an extraordinary financial investment, but it is certainly a wise precautionary investment. So highly recommend that you work with your IT professionals to see what available email domains are out there and go ahead and purchase those before the fraudsters do. So how exactly does imposter fraud work? And the FBI has reported at least over $2 billion of losses. So this is a type of fraud that is growing very quickly and a type of fraud that we need to ensure that you all understand. So as I mentioned, imposter fraud is about a fraudster posing as a person of authority within your company or a vendor or a business partner, and they're requesting a payment or a change to an existing payment instructions. So why impersonate executives? Well, if you think about it, they travel frequently, right, and as such are typically very difficult to contact to verify payment instructions. Additionally, because of their stature at the company, accounts payables clerks who are in the weeds doing the work, they may be uncomfortable questioning anything that appears to come from them. And if the company culture includes a demanding leader who often requests ad hoc payments, then the fraudster has a prime ecosystem available for them to perpetrate. So there needs to be a culture change, right? Company executives should communicate with and assure their back office staff that it is absolutely okay and even expected to question any payment requests. And this is important as the message needs to come from the top down. People need to feel empowered, accountable, and safe to question where they are sending the company funds. And vendors are making excellent targets as well because contact typically is via email. There is, there is no longer the ability to just walk across a cube and talk to somebody face-to-face. Vendor relationships are typically via email because they're often overseas as well. So, and the people, those accounts payables clerk, they aren't the ones who are managing the relationships. So when you think about the number of vendors you deal with to keep your dealership running, it is not surprising that the avenue is being tapped by the fraudsters. And to add to these dynamics, normal human behavior is such that we are all head down working to keep things moving without really paying attention. We have been conditioned to get things done with the least amount of resistance. We don't typically want to question authority because we want to impress the big boss. We want to do what he or she has requested. And they don't have that great relationship with the executives or even the vendors that these requests are originating from. So it is simply about moving that request off their desk and working on the next thing. So what can be done to protect your company from imposter fraud? Knowing that the fraudsters are perpetrating all levels of the organization, it is absolutely critical that everyone, regardless of whether they touch a payment or not, everyone needs to be educated and aware of the imposing threats that exist on our fraud landscape today. We need to authenticate payment requests, especially those that are received via email. And when you do authenticate, please do so via a channel other than which it was received. Meaning, if the request was received via email, pick up the phone, call your contact using the contact information that you have within your files. If you attempt to call the number that was on the request, that is most likely fraudulent too. And if you receive a phone call and the fraudsters are picking up the phone and are calling their victims directly, so if you get that phone call requesting payment instructions should be changed, follow up with an email. Don't ask them to send you an email because they will send you an email with the spoofed domain. You initiate an email to your contact that you have on file, and that will ensure that you're getting to the appropriate person. And also, alert your business partners and your vendors now about this threat, as they could be victims too. And when you start questioning and authenticating future correspondence from them, they will know why. And you're doing them a good deed, I guess, because they could be working with their other vendors. And as we continue this education amongst all parties, it will help to strengthen the fight against fraud. Imposter fraud is another good reason to reconcile your accounts daily, okay? You know, it used to be monitor your accounts, you know, at the end of the month. That is no longer acceptable. We need to monitor our accounts on a daily basis. So I encourage you to think back. Have you had a vendor send instructions to change their banking information maybe last week or a month ago? And since you may not find out that the request was fraudulent until your vendor calls inquiring about the payment, you may already have fraudulent transactions in flight. So I recommend that you, if your company solely relies on email for vendor banking changes, you may want to start a process to look back at your payments 30, 60, 90, even 120 days, because you can be a victim as you're sitting on this webinar today and not even know it. So that I want to make sure that we start taking questions from you, and if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the screen, and we'll address those as I wrap up. What I would really like for you to walk away from this webinar today. This is just the first step. Attending this webinar today, learning about account takeover fraud and imposter fraud is just the first step. But we need your assistance to help raise this awareness. Start a conversation with your executive, your coworkers, your vendors, your other business partners, everyone. Like I said, it is so critical that everyone understands. They do not need to be a fraud ambassador, right? But at least just be aware that there is these threats that are out there on the landscape. And at least if there is a slight awareness and you know where to get information, then that could be the first step, okay? So as you see here, to help increase awareness of online imposter fraud, you know, again, meet with your AP staff and your internal partners. You know, perhaps have a conversation with your executives. Maybe a bulletin can be distributed if that's how your dealership typically communicates information down to the staff. Whatever works for you. This is all about being prepared before it happens. It's not about if, it is about when. So if you develop your internal protocols and practice, go through a dry run, figure out where your gaps are, and then help close those gaps, that will ensure that you have a strong defense when the fraudsters come knocking and try to attack. You are going to get a copy of this webinar by the end of the week, and that will be an email that you can leverage to start your conversations with your team members, with your executives, with your vendors, your business partners, et cetera. So as we go ahead and start collecting some Q&A, if you would, you know, there was a question that came at time of registration. So what would be 3 takeaways from this session, right? What I would say to you is, you know, understand the fraud threats that are out there, right? Understand what imposter fraud is all about. Understand that account takeover is out there. Account takeover is about the fraudsters trying to download malware onto your device, and they want to do the work, right? They want to steal your credentials. They want to initiate the transaction. They want to move your money over to their accounts, right? Account takeover fraud is where the fraudsters do the majority of the work. Imposter fraud is really leveraging you as a user to move funds from your account to theirs, and they're relying on your weak internal controls, your lack of authentication, to simply move the money to their accounts. They sit back and they wait, and they are very patient. So do not be surprised if you see a request saying the next time you submit an invoice, please submit it to this new account at this new bank, and you update your accounts payable system, and the next time an invoice comes in, your payment will be going to the fraudster's account. They no longer need that immediate reaction. They are absolutely willing to correspond with you and sit there and wait for you to make those transactions. And it's, again, you making the transactions with your credentials, your computer. There is no malware needed for imposter fraud. So again, that's sort of the first takeaway. Understand the differences between account takeover fraud and imposter fraud. The second is look back through the best practices that I know we quickly reviewed, but look back through those best practices. And not all of those best practices are going to be able to be implemented within your company. Every company is different, and that's okay, right? But again, it's about using some of those best practices and building what works for your company, right? Building those protocols, and then once they are built, finding a testing schedule. Perhaps you do it quarterly. Perhaps you do it monthly. Perhaps you do it monthly as you start off the rollout of those, and then you do a quarterly test. And if those quarterly tests are successful, then you can move on to perhaps an annual test. But keeping it on top of mind will ensure that everyone is dotting the I's and crossing the T's when this type of correspondence is coming through. And the third thing that I would say that you need to take away from this session is make a promise to yourself, make a promise to your company that you will have a conversation, right, with at least one person, and ask that person to have a conversation with another peer or an executive. Maybe you don't, maybe you're not in a position where you can have a conversation with, you know, an upper executive, and that's okay. But start with the folks that you can have a conversation with and ask them and stress the importance of ensuring that the information gets to the top, and then once it's at the top, it comes back down. Okay, so I have a question from James. So what is the biggest mistake people make with personal information online, right? So I talked about social engineering, people sharing too much information. So, you know, and that is, it is important, you know, as you are a personal user of social media, you know, I'm sure you've heard of the best practices. You know, if you're going on vacation, be thoughtful around what you're putting on your social networks, because, you know, thieves see that your home is now vacant, and that will be a great time for them to break in and rob your house while you're enjoying yourself on the beach, right? So similar with companies, right? If you're having a large, you know, stockholder event, or, you know, some sort of event at a particular dealership where you know, and now the public knows, that there is going to be executives pulled from their original location to another location, and those executives are going to be out of pocket, you know, that is a great opportunity that the fraudsters see, and they're going to tap into that. So be careful about what you are sharing. Perhaps think about sharing it after the fact, later that day. It was a great event, not this will be a great event, right? And then both personally as well as professionally, you know, as you log into your work email, right, or your other corporate applications, right? I know we all are inundated with user IDs and passwords. We use the same password repeatedly, right? It is hard to manage a number of passwords, but just remember, you know, once the password is out there and it's shared with a tool or an application or a website, it is out there forever, right? So when the data security breaches occur and they have your login and they have your password and you reuse that password for a number of your tools and applications and other websites, vendor websites, et cetera, right? Once they have that list, the fraudsters go out and see, you know, where they can make it work. So, you know, try to have and create in your mind sort of a methodology of sorts of how you can have perhaps a similar base password, but you're alternating it based upon perhaps the vendor that you're interacting with or the website you're going to. Try to make it at least slightly different. Okay, any other questions from the audience out there? Okay, Dan, go ahead. I don't have any other questions online portal, so if you would, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so very much, Amy. That was outstanding information. Audience, let me share some upcoming program with you real quick. On 8/16, we're going to look at the used vehicle market. We're going to have Vice President, Senior VP, who has retired from one of the publics, the big publics. He does a lot of consulting with Wall Street and a lot of the big hedge funds that invest in this space. And he's going to share with us his observations on where the market sits, what the wholesale volumes look like coming through the lanes, some of the pricing pressures we're seeing, and some of the wholesale losses that we're starting to observe. So join us again on August the 16th for that session. It promises to really be insightful, and hopefully Mike will share some of his best practices that he used with the launch of several very, very successful programs at one of the big publics. Please put on your calendar. We're all in the election season. The convention's going on this week in Cleveland. we're going to have an Election Day series that will start in September, run November or October, and then end in November. So please follow that. We have future announcements coming pertaining to the details around that program. It promises to be very exciting. You won't want to miss that. We will have a member of Congress that will be joining us, who is also a car dealer. We'll have a recap and projection on some elections, and then we'll have a roundup in November on the election results and basically what that might mean for the industry. So please join us for that series. Again, watch for future announcements. That'll be coming very, very soon. Again, we'll be getting out the recording of today's programming. If anybody from your store would benefit from today's program, have them join us for the 4 p.m. session. That'll be 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you in August on Tuesday the 16th, the third Tuesday of the month. Thank you. Have a great day and a good selling week. Bye-bye.